Is the CNAB general meeting, August 18th, 2021. Thank you all for coming today. Sounds like it's gonna be demos. So we'll just jump right into that. One of the things that I have been working on for honestly the past couple months is storing a little bit of extra information as part of what's stored when you install a bundle, to be able to more clearly identify the concept of an installation itself. We have claims, right? And that's every time you run the bundle, it generates a claim. It has a unique installation associated with it. But at a higher level, let's say your tool writing a command line, like writing a command line tool that needs to be able to say list and show you a single installation. It's incredibly helpful to be able to have a single document or record that represents the installation and can have specific metadata associated with it so that you can kind of interact with it as like a first class, fully supported resource. So I wrote up an installation state specification, and we decided to vet it in Porter first before really going too far with the spec, because we figured it would change after we implemented it. And it did. It changed a lot compared to what I originally put in the spec. So I'd like to show you what this looks like. Let me change what I'm sharing so it's the whole screen. Great. So I'm going to show you with Porter here. So if I do Porter list, we're going to see some slightly
Carolyn,
new...
could you zoom in for a bit? Sorry.
Oh yeah, of course, of course.
Thanks.
How about, is that even zooming in? You getting it?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. We have a new field now that we track directly on this installation record, which is namespace. We've completely ripped off Kubernetes. Yes, great, let's move on. So I can do things like this now. I can say Porter list all namespaces, and I can see all my data. So I have something in dev, I have something in test. Here I have something that doesn't quite map to Kubernetes one-to-one, which is there's no namespace set at all. The way Porter is going about this is an empty namespace is going to be treated as a global installation. And the way we're scoping things is that within a namespace, you can interact with other resources that are in your namespace. So you could have two installations that maybe one depends on the other and is able to use outputs from the installation. Maybe you have WordPress and a database, right? And you want to be able to get the connection string from that database. That's allowed if they're both in the same namespace. And to be honest, dependencies is what drove this entire feature. So that's why I'm giving that as an example. There's another thing people were really keen on being able to do, though, is have a global, like, shared resource. So the way we're tackling that in Porter is saying when the namespace is empty, it's essentially like a global resource and anyone can reference it. So you could have I called it shared thing. Let's just say it's like a really expensive giant dev database that everyone can use. You may then want to be able to say, it doesn't matter if I'm in dev or test or whatever, using that installation and getting the connection string for it and being able to use its outputs is fair game. So we have installations stored in a namespace now and scoped a bit. You can also label them. So I could do something like Porter show hello. And have a little bit of extra information that wasn't there before, but the key piece of information is now you can associate labels with your installation and then add whatever metadata you want. So like this is mine in a shared environment. This is pretty useful to allow people to kind of figure out what goes with what. As you add lots and lots of installations, having metadata like this just makes it easier to manage. So what I can do now is go porter list and say owner Days Labs. And oops, let's look at all namespaces. Okay, wait, what did I just miss? 1 second. We were just looking at that one. Oh, I messed up. It's not owner, it's team. Let's try that again. Great, there we go. So you can see that across all the namespaces, I have 2 that are labeled as being for our team. And we also have this flag, all namespaces, so you can look at everything. So when I go to install, let me clear this out. I'm going to do porter install. I can specify what namespace I want something to go into here. So I'm going to put it in the demo namespace. You don't have to, for porter, namespaces aren't a resource in and of themselves. You don't have to make them ahead of time. You just use it and it's there. So I'm going to install that and we're going to call it demo and we're going to call it CNAB. And we're going to use, it doesn't really matter, just any bundle. And I can also apply labels at this time. So I can go label, demo true. And you can put more on there. So now if I show this, I do porter show, and I look at the demo namespace. There it is. I've also modified porter's config. So we have the concept, again, riffing off of Kubernetes whenever it makes sense. If I look at my porter config file, let's scroll up here a little bit. I have a default namespace set for dev. To kind of preserve continuity, the default namespace is empty. It's the global namespace. When we import people's data in, it's all going to go at the global level. So let's look at a couple more of these bundles here. Let's look at Credentials tutorial. There's a couple extra pieces of information that's stored on here as well. And I kind of glossed over this before, but other things that the installation is tracking is the bundle repository, not the full reference that's stored on the claim. And it says this is the exact bundle that we used when we ran it. Instead, we're allowed to pair a bundle repository with an installation and essentially have it follow it. So I can say, okay, this installation uses the creds tutorial. At the moment, I want it on version 0.10, and this is, maybe you're pinning to digest instead. You can pin it to a digest. What we're setting up the path for in Porter is for you to be able to edit the installation, change that version to, 0.5, and have it trigger a reconciliation where instead of doing imperative commands where you say porter install, porter upgrade, and you're re-specifying everything that installation needs each time, the installation is able to have your preferences essentially set up with it and says, this is what I want the installation to look like. I want it to be with this bundle. I want it to use this version. And if I change the version, it'll automatically upgrade. And then in order to support being able to have Porter automatically run things on your behalf, and it would run things not as the command line tool, but as a Kubernetes operator, to be clear, you need to be able to say, what is everything I need in order to be able to run these commands for me? If Porter operator is going to run upgrade for me, well, it's going to need to know what parameters to pass, but it's also going to need to know what credentials. We're not hard coding credentials, but what we are doing is associating credential sets, a named mapping of these are the credentials I want to pass to the bundle, and this is where I can find them. So I have team GitHub here, which essentially just stores my GitHub token. And now, say the operator needs to do an upgrade. If I bump that version number, it'll know to automatically pull in and use the team GitHub credential sets. That's not implemented yet, but that's like the next step. That's what we're trying to lead to, is being able to either work with bundles imperatively and just run, I want to run this exact upgrade command and here are all the flags, etc. But then have another mode where you just say, this is what I want it to look like. So we do this for credential sets. We also do this for parameters. Parameters, we can store a little bit more information. We're kind of trying not to run afoul of the specs requirement that you not store like credentials. We just kind of reference them and different people use different credentials. A lot of the stuff I'm doing here is more targeted for a whole team managing something. You have maybe you have like a shared team Discord, for example, or wiki, and you would then probably have like team creds or something, and that's what's being used by your installation. So we also store parameters, and there's two different ways you can associate parameters with an installation so that if you needed to upgrade it later, what parameters would it use when it automatically runs upgrade for you? You can either remember individual parameters, and this is what you would have typed in the command line. You would have typed in, porter install param name equals Carolyn, right? Instead of doing that, you can put them directly on the installation and just remember which ones you want to use. So I'm using demo here. And then you can also associate as many parameter sets as you want as well. So I have like general dev parameters that I use. Maybe I'm turning on debug, setting the log level really high, things like that. And this kind of gives us all the components we need to be able to have like kind of a more rich, dare I say, GitOps focus way of interacting with our bundles, and being able to store this data for an installation is what's enabling us to do that. When I added this feature, what I immediately ran into is problems with our data access layer and how we query. You notice like we had porter list, and we could do a couple things, right? I could specify a namespace. I could do a label and say like, this is what I'm looking for. Like I'm looking for team, Days Labs. I can also just filter by the name a little bit. Maybe I'm looking for anything that has the word hello in it. Okay, it'll find that for me. Up until this point, the CNAB Spec has made a recommendation about what documents should look like. This is the exact format for bundle.json. This is the exact format for claim. In CNAB Go, though, in our implementation, we had kind of a full pattern of this is how you should probably be storing claims, retrieving them, piping them into the runtime, and tools like Porter and Duffel were just using it. And it was essentially written with the intention of flat file storage. It could be stored in blob storage. It could be on your local file system. It wasn't really, it kind of made like a very lowest common denominator decision about what types of backends we could support. Okay. And it has made querying, like what you see here, not perform well. Because we had this very general access pattern that was just create, retrieve, update, delete, and list. And anytime you wanted more than that, you were making a lot of excessive calls and it became very chatty. So the change that's here, this hasn't been submitted as a PR yet, because we're still vetting. We want to make sure we kind of work out all the kinks here, is I've taken the data access layer that says how to retrieve documents out of CNAB Go. And then what's in CNAB Go, what's left, are just documents that are provided to the runtime, right? So a claim, right? You give that to a bundle when it's executing. So the claims structure is in CNAB Go. What isn't in CNAB Go right now is what does an installation look like? I kind of have that definition in the spec, but to be honest, the runtime never uses it. So I'm starting to rethink what really needs to be in the spec and what doesn't. The point of the spec is to let you make a bundle and run it with other tools, right? And for a while, we thought maybe it'd be great if two tools could share the same data storage. And if I want to like walk that back. I don't think that's been very helpful to us. I feel like it's really hindered our ability to kind of innovate, because if I wanted to do more rich querying, all of a sudden I'm stuck with something that was not intended for that purpose. So things like installation are in Porter now. So it can store any extra information it's keen on without having to kind of get that through CNAB first, because it's not related to the runtime. And then the back end is completely different. We store things in Mongo now. Boop, 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 boop. So here's our config file. By default, it'll store using the MongoDB Docker plugin. So what that means is that when I run Porter list or anything that needs data access for the very first time, we'll look at this config file and see how do you want to access Mongo. Maybe it's an actual real connection string, which is great. You can put that in there. But for like local dev and tests and things like that, we kind of want to minimize what people have to set up. So we'll actually just spin up a Docker container for you, and then use a named volume as well, and keep that a volume around, so that you run Porter, it collects a whole bunch of data inside of that volume. It's a dev machine, so at some point you just kill every single container on your machine. That's fine. The volume's still there. When you run Porter again, it'll just respin up that container and use that to talk to Mongo. So it's just kind of given us the ability to have querying and all sorts of things, and a lot of clouds support it, so that's what we went for. What's great about this, though, is that this is a Porter decision now. It's not a CNAB decision by moving more things out of CNAB Go. So I think this will be really helpful to everyone. So for example, Datadog has never been using the data access layer that's inside of CNAB Go. They needed something more optimized. I think it just makes sense for a lot of tools to not be tied down like that. So let's take a look at what this looks like in Mongo. We're kind of organizing in collections, very similar to what you've seen in our data previously. So we have like a bucket for results and parameters and credentials. So for installations here, a lot of this looks very similar to what you saw in show. You can see like, oh, I'm associated with this bundle repo. But we can also store extra things that are useful for doing fast querying, like what was the last run that modified the installation. Things like that make it really easy to show that list command where I go here, if I go Porter list, these are now calculated very quickly, and you don't need a ton of queries for it, which is great because we're able to essentially just show this off of the status. And then everything else kind of looks the same. Like, here's results. It stores a little bit of extra information on each one. It's not the exact schema that you see in CNAB Spec, but that's fine. Porter can make this decision to optimize its queries and things like that. So that's what I wanted to show. Are there any questions?
This was great. One question I have is, what are the things that are supposed to land in the CNAB Spec that are, whether they're planned to, or there should be consensus on, or stuff like that?
Yeah. So let's look at that. Originally, in a pull request, I have this right now, which was the idea of expanding, essentially expanding the claims state of the claims document to include everything, all the state related to an installation. This is kind of where I started, right? And the reason why I haven't moved this forward at all is because I've changed my mind. I'd rather only have things related to the runtime in the spec. So I don't want this anymore. Yeah, I'm going to close this PR. And what I'd like to add instead is just enough that we can support the runtime. So walking back to why I wanted this entire feature in the first place was dependencies. We're really keen on expanding that dependency specification so that I can rely on a bundle not just by the exact reference and version that I want to use. So going back to the WordPress example, right? I need a MySQL database, okay? And right now, the way dependencies work is you get one every time you install WordPress. You get your own fresh one. But what people would like to be able to do is, for example, install a suite of microservices and all 5 of them need one database. Or in an environment, I have a shared database and everyone just uses different collections or prefixes, whatever, so they can happily like coexist. So the dependencies proposal that I'm working on allows you to use namespaces and labels to be able to qualify, this is the installation I'd like to have. This is what I'd like to depend on. I want to depend on something that's capable of MySQL in this namespace. And if it exists, great, I'll reuse it. And if it doesn't exist, I'll make sure those labels are on it so that the next time something's installed, it's able to reuse it. So the concept of namespaces and labels at that point becomes somewhat of a runtime concern because dependencies need to understand that and say, what is an installation? It does have a namespace associated to it. It has a scope. These are the scoping rules. And these are the labels, and this is how matches are done for dependencies. But beyond that, a lot of the things I showed you around storage and what particular fields are on installation and all that, I don't feel is relevant. I'm going to collaborate more with Jacob actually on this because I know he wants to use dependencies as well. So we'll try to figure out like what do we really need and what is something that we can just leave up to the tools. So it may be more like installation documents will be introduced in the spec and we'll say it's used for dependencies. And then it must have these 2 things, namespace labels. But beyond that, there could be more, there could be less. It's fine, So rewrite, that's the answer. I don't know how people feel about that. I'm guessing butchers like Carolyn, you've been doing the spec wrong this whole time, but I don't know. I'm just going to awkwardly draw it out and see if I can get anyone to say anything. Are we cool with this direction of keeping the CNAB spec mostly to runtime and then otherwise non-normative?
Yeah, Butcher is writing in chat.
Oh, is he really? I'm so sorry. I'm sharing my full screen.
It's a little noisy here, but the lawnmower stopped for a minute in the background. Yeah, no,
Okay.
We can't keep it. I want to keep it largely to runtime considerations and the structure of the CNAB packages, right? Yeah. And anything we need to be able to do that uniformly across implementations. The non-normative sections have largely been designed to allow people to come up with specs for collaboration, but not ones that every runtime would have to do in order to be compliant, right? So claims, for example, doesn't necessarily, and the spec was structured that way, right? So that you could say I'm compliant to core spec, which means all the packages that are produced according to the spec should be installable by your platform. But core spec was, and then security spec was really like an optional add-on and things like that, claim spec. And I don't mind doing them that way so that people can say very specifically, our implementation conforms to these specific specs. But the danger of conflating the core spec with things that are actually optional and really only necessary if you want to interoperate behind the scenes with things, that's where I get a little bit nervous, because then you will have quote unquote non-compliant instances that are compliant in all the important things, but not necessarily compliant to the background details, right? So that's kind of where I fall on that.
Do you have a recommendation? For the moment, the concept of an installation in general, and having a namespace and labels is 100% intended just to support the dependencies spec. Try to just put it in there and expand it through the dependency spec and not really tweak any of the other ones or introduce a new one.
Unless you think you can demonstrate that it's required by something outside that spec, I would leave it localized to that spec.
Okay, that's great because it simplifies things a lot. So I will do that after we're almost done with all this work. There's just a bit more to support an operator and be able to do that reconciliation I was talking about. But when we've seen that working and we're pretty confident we don't need any further changes, I will submit this is just a change to dependency spec then, and it'll be very small, which would be great. So that's what I had to show there. Radu, you said that you had a demo? Maybe?
I didn't.
You didn't? Okay, never mind. I thought maybe you had something to show with Signy. I misunderstood. Cool. Well, that's all I had. So we can just call it a day. And Chris, when you watch this, I hope you like it. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. See you in a couple weeks.